Good evening. In January 2002, one of our panelists, Jim Post, with his wife Jeanette, gathered with other parishioners from St. John the Evangelist Parish in Wellesley to discuss what Jim describes as the stunning revelations of clergy sexual abuse and cover-up in the Archdiocese of Boston. As Jim says, the shock of those revelations produced a determination to do something to fix a church in need. By February 2002, Voice of the Faithful had been created with the mission of providing, and I quote, a prayerful voice through which the faithful can participate in the governance and guidance of the Catholic Church. 3 goals were stated: to support survivors of sexual abuse, to support priests of integrity, and to work on structural change. Welcome to a panel discussion on the Voice of the Faithful, its impact and prospects. I'm Pat DeLue, a Vice Provost at Boston College. We're here this evening to mark an anniversary of VOTF. It's 6 years now since that February of 2002, as well as to mark the publication of this volume, Voices of the Faithful, Loyal Catholics Striving for Change, a volume in our C21 series. You can see them all outside, thanks to our bookstore. The volume, edited by Bill D'Antonio and Tony Pogorelic, is the proceedings of a conference that was held again under C21 auspices here in October of 2005. The volume and the conference presented research by these 2 sociologists on VOTF, as well as some papers that are captured here as essays in this volume. With me this evening are 4 panelists who will discuss the lasting impact and significance of VOTF from their varying perspectives. First, in the broader context of society and culture, Alan Wolfe. Then, in the light of prior church history, Jim O'Toole. In the experience of one intimately involved in the beginning of VOTF, Jim Post. And in the life of the church, Father Dennis Sheehan. I'll introduce each of our panelists more fully in a moment. After our panelists speak, I will ask them some questions, and then, and I hope it does, if time permits, I'll invite all of you, or some of you, to speak briefly on your view of VOTF and what difference it has made and will make in the life of the church. So let's begin. Our first panelist is Professor Alan Wolfe. He's professor of political science and director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. Alan's most recent books include Does American Democracy Still Work? More about that later.
Yes, you know.
Return to Greatness, How America Lost Its Sense of Purpose and What It Needs to Do to Recover It. The Transformation of American Religion, How We Actually Live Our Faith, and An Intellectual in Public. A contributing editor of The New Republic, The Wilson Quarterly, Commonwealth Magazine, and In Character, Professor Wolfe writes often for those publications, as well as for Commonweal, The New York Times, Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, The Washington Post, and other magazines and newspapers. So you know Alan's name and read his work. Professor Wolfe.
Thank you very much, Pat, and it's a pleasure and honor to serve with such distinguished commentators on such an important topic. I sometimes feel as if my professional life is divided in half. I do academic research and speak to academics, but I also try, as Pat's introduction suggested, to talk to the general public as well. And rarely do those 2 worlds intersect, but they do in one sense, a sense that I want to use as the framework for my remarks. There's a book written by an academic, a very distinguished academic, a long-term member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, named Albert Hirschman, that had a great impact upon me, and I think helps us understand the issues involved with Voice of the Faithful. The book was called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, and its subtitle was Response to Decline in Organizations. And Hirschman's argument was that when an organization faces a crisis, any kind of organization, there are three options: exit, voice, and loyalty. And he goes through each one of them. Loyalty is one, certainly. People who say, I'm going to do everything I can not to leave this organization, to be loyal to it, to be loyal to the people who work for it, to stay within it, and so on, is a very, very interesting idea. It's a very interesting response to any kind of difficult situation. I teach a course on religion and politics at Boston College, and in the course I deal with what I call a contrasting ethics that used to dominate American life in the 1950s and the 1960s, and I call one of them the Protestant ethic and one of them the Catholic ethic. And the Protestant ethic is essentially an ethic of individualism. The Catholic ethic, at least at that time, was an ethic of loyalty, of putting loyalty to one's organization first, whether it was the fire department you worked for, the school system you sent your children to, or the church to which you belonged. Loyalty in that sense, we today would characterize as blind loyalty, as loyalty without questions, as my country right or wrong, my church right or wrong, my family right or wrong, as things that one simply accepts. One accepts the authority of the organization over the individual and pledges to be loyal to it even when the organization does wrong. This was an enormously important ethic in American life, and it retains its power in many American institutions. But for many Americans, including many Catholic Americans, that kind of loyalty, blind loyalty, no longer suffices. It no longer suffices in their politics, it no longer suffices in their workplace, and it no longer suffices in the church. And so this book, whose publication we are honoring, called Voices of the Faithful, Loyal Catholics Striving for Change, is talking about Catholics today who are loyal in a very different way than Catholics were a generation or two ago. That kind of loyalty, blind loyalty, I simply accept and will not question and will never criticize and will always say that people in authority got it right and it's not my job to ever second guess them. That kind of loyalty is no longer an option. It's no longer an option in our foreign policy, and it's no longer an option in our churches. So one of Albert Hirschman's three options really isn't available to us. The second is what Hirschman calls exit. You simply get fed up with an organization and you leave it. That's actually something that's happening widely in American life and widely in American Catholicism. On Monday of this week, the Pew Forum, an organization in Washington, D.C., conducted the largest survey, the most important survey of the American religious landscape ever conducted. It's been all over the news. If you didn't happen to see me commenting with Emily Rooney on it last night in Greater Boston, well, you get a second chance. I have an op-ed in Friday's Boston Globe outlining the main aspects of what the Pew Report discovered. And there was a very, very significant section of the Pew Report dealing with contemporary American Catholicism. And the gist of the report is that, as many people have observed, Catholics have been a relatively constant proportion of the American population over the years, roughly 1/4. The Pew Report puts it, I think, at 23.9% of Americans are Catholic. But when you break that down, when you look inside the figures, and in particular when you look at immigration, you discover that for native-born Catholics, Catholics born in this country, there is a full-scale exit from the church. It is a church, as the Pew Report described it, in free fall, that if it weren't for so high levels of immigration coming in and replenishing the pews would increasingly be empty. So exit is certainly an option that more and more people are taking. But there are problems. Just as there are problems with blind loyalty, there are problems with exit. We generally don't like to exit the organizations that have been so important to us. And even when we do, we usually retain a certain very strong sense of loyalty. My students at Boston College, for example, are enormously proud of their Catholicism. They identify with it, they talk about it all the time, but they've also, in a sense, exited or at least exited from the Catholicism of their parents and their grandparents. It's no longer the same kind of church for them. They are there. They want to be part of the church. But if the church continues in the way it has, they've, in a sense, exited. Some of them more quietly than others, but many of them have exited. So that is certainly a second option. It's always been interesting to me, and I want to ask Jim Post this, that when Voices of the Faithful started, it took Albert Hirschman's third concept of voice and put it right in its title. And I always wondered if that was intentional or not, because voice is really the best alternative to either blind loyalty or to capricious exit. Voice means that you stay in the organization, but you try to make your voice heard. That you say, I am not going to give up on this organization because it means so much to me. But at the same time, because it means so much to me, I'm also not going to allow it to, in a sense, commit suicide. I'm not going to allow it to take steps that will harm it, not because I criticize it, but because I love it, because I have that kind of loyalty, the kind of loyalty that is acknowledged in the subtitle. It seems to me that this is an enormously important aspect of a response to an organization that Voices of the Faithful has stood for, and that the voice element is just enormously important. Now, do organizations want to hear from their members when they exercise their voice? Well, some do more than others. And I'll leave it to you to judge and evaluate the Catholic Church with respect to that. But the truth of the matter is that making one's voice heard is a kind of what I would call a brute fact of American life these days. No organization can ignore it. Just today, the U.S. Supreme Court was dealing with the fallout of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Exxon Valdez cannot ignore the voice of people in Alaska who are influenced by that disaster. As we see in the presidential campaign taking place around us, the people who make a foreign policy cannot avoid the voice of Americans who want to have a say when their sons and daughters are being killed or when they're asked to pay trillions of dollars to support the war effort. Voice is a fact of life. The question is not whether voice is the appropriate or the best option to an organization facing a crisis. Voice is the only option. And that's why, for me, it is, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, such an honor and a pleasure to speak along with people who have been involved in an organization that brings out the best of what Americans should do when they find themselves deeply loyal to an institution in the way Americans should be loyal and unwilling to exit from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Our second speaker is Professor Jim O'Toole. Jim is the Clough Professor of History at Boston College. A former archivist of the Archdiocese of Boston, Jim now teaches and studies the history of religion in America, particularly the history of American Catholicism. Jim's most recent book, which will be published next month by Harvard University Press, is The Faithful, A History of Catholics in America. Jim.
Thanks, Pat. Historians, as you might expect, regardless of what they might believe, religiously believe first and foremost in historical context. The past is prologue, after all, as someone says in Shakespeare's Tempest, and so I take it as my role tonight to say something about the context for current and recent efforts on the part of lay people in the Catholic Church in the United States. One could go back farther than I do to precedents in Europe and other parts of the world over the last couple of millennia, but I want to mention some examples nearer to home here in the U.S., examples that I think provide the context and the precedents, the prologue for our current experience with Catholicism. And the particular part of that context that I want to emphasize is what I call, in the book Pat was kind enough to mention, what I call there the Church of Catholic Action. which I see as a distinguishing characteristic of Catholicism in the United States in the several decades before the Second Vatican Council, the decades of the first half of the 20th century. The key phrase is Catholic action. That was in the 1920s and 30s, 40s and 50s, I think, a phrase that came readily to American Catholic lips, the lips of lay people especially. Pope Pius XI had used the phrase Catholic action in an encyclical letter in 1931, and he defined it as the participation of the laity in the apostolate of the hierarchy. This was the idea that the Pope was endorsing, that the work of the Church was the work of lay people too, not just the work of what we might call the religious professionals, priests, sisters, bishops, and so on. The understanding was that in Catholic action, laity would always cooperate with and be directed by the leaders of the institutional Church, but that there were some things that only lay people could and indeed should do to advance the work of the Church. From what I've read of that period, from the sources that are left behind, it seems to me that American Catholics in particular embraced this idea of Catholic action, and lay Catholic groups under the banner of Catholic action proliferated and were everywhere in American Catholicism in the half-century before the Second Vatican Council. Now, I should say that American Catholics, of course, had been accustomed to forming all kinds of groups practically from the beginning of their experience in the United States. And throughout the 19th century, there had been a proliferation of local parish-based groups of all kinds, altar societies and rosary sodalities for the women of the parish, the Holy Name Society and the St. Vincent de Paul Society for the men, the Catholic Youth Organization for the kids, the Knights of Columbus, of course, and their affiliated Daughters of Isabella, together with a host of other ethnic knights of St. George for Germans, of St. Mary of Częstochowa for Polish Catholics, Knights of Lithuania for Lithuanian Catholics, Knights of St. Peter Claver for African American Catholics. I like to say that in groups like all of those, American Catholics picked up the organizational habit close to home in their own parishes before they applied it on a wider scale. Now, none of those groups that I've mentioned was an expression of Catholic action as the phrase came to be defined later on. But I think those later groups could not have succeeded without that organizational base in local parishes. These groups encouraged Catholics to think about changing themselves, to pray more devoutly, to stop cursing in the case of the Holy Name Society. These groups encouraged Catholics to think about changing themselves. Catholic action got them used to thinking of the idea that they might change society as well. And that was the crucial shift that happened with Catholic action. Groups promoting this active involvement of the laity in the work of the Church were similarly widespread, and the names of some of them may be familiar to some of you. Some of you were and or perhaps are members of some of these organizations. I'll mention just a few examples. The Catholic Worker Movement, of course, founded by Dorothy Day, built on and committed to direct and personal work with the poor and the disadvantaged. The National Catholic Rural Life Conference, organized during the Depression of the 1930s to help the farmers, Catholic farmers, especially in the Midwest, cope with the Depression, forming farm cooperatives, credit unions, and so on. You read some of the statements of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference about industrialized agriculture and plowing under the family farm. You close your eyes, you think you're reading tracts from the Communist Party, but the Catholic Rural Life Conference was committed to that kind of program. The Grail, another rural movement, particularly for women, based on a farm commune outside Cincinnati, Ohio, that developed a lot of programs for the promotion of the liturgical arts, music. Liturgical dance really gets its start in the United States at the Grail, for example. The Association of Catholic Trade Unionists, another organization founded by a Bostonian, John Court, just died a couple of years ago, for Catholics in organized labor. The Catholic Trade Unionists ran labor schools in American parishes, graduated 5,000 men a year, union members all, who gathered in their local parish church to study church social teaching. And then apply it to the workplace. There were Catholic interracial councils that were expressions of Catholic action, addressing problems of racial segregation in the Jim Crow era and providing a base for later Catholic participation in the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. I would even argue that the Legion of Decency, which some of you may remember, combating immorality in the movies, I would even argue that the Legion of Decency was an expression of Catholic action. A particular moral vision that lay people, and the Legion was a lay organization from top to bottom, though it cooperated with the hierarchy, that was an expression of Catholic action. Most of all, though, probably the best expression is the Christian family movement, a Catholic action effort to organize Catholics literally where they lived, in their own homes, based on couples getting together with other couples in their neighborhood, studying Scripture, studying church social teaching, and then applying it to their own particular circumstances. Each one of these organizations that I've mentioned has its own history, but what's significant about all of them, I think, is that they were overwhelmingly the product of lay initiative. Bishops and priests encouraged, but lay people were the ones who put these organizations together and allowed them to flourish. And taken together, I think these Catholic action groups helped spread and solidify the message that lay people did indeed have their own role in the work of the Church. They accustomed Catholics to the notion that Catholicism was not just a Sunday thing. It might be a Tuesday or a Friday night thing. Religion was not something that just happened in church. It happened in the slum settlement house. It happened in the fields. It happened on the picket line. It even happened while cooking the family dinner. And I think all subsequent, and I would say myself, future activities on the part of the faithful build on that foundation of Catholic action. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. In June of 2002, James E. Post was elected president of VOTF. He continued to serve in that capacity until March 2006. He is now completing his term as a member of VOTF's Board of Trustees. In Jim's other life, he is the recently named John F. Smith, Jr. Professor of Management at Boston University, where he teaches and writes on strategic management, corporate governance, ethics, and nonprofit management. Jim.
Thank you, Pat, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many friends in the audience, and to be at Boston College again, as we have gathered so many times in the past. This institution has done so much under Father Leahy's leadership and under the leadership of people throughout the administration, in the various departments, the faculty, so much to help the Catholic community in Boston and in the country at large deal with the issues that we've come face to face with in the last 6 years. And so it's both fitting that we're here. It's also, I think, it's an opportunity for us to express our deep thanks to Boston College for all that it has done as a community part of the Catholic community, but to show the way and provide leadership that we badly needed from. Alan talked about the role of Catholic colleges. Catholic colleges and Catholic young people are so much at the heart of what brought us together originally. If it wasn't for protecting children, that's what I think stimulated so many people to get up out of their chairs, out of their couches, and to come together to meetings and to conferences and so forth, to engage this set of questions about how our church could have gotten into the predicament that it is, and how what we were going to do to fix that. So it's great to be at Boston College and to think about all that the college has contributed to the progress that's been made over these past half dozen years. During the time I was president of Voice of the Faithful, I made a lot of decisions, and most of those decisions were done with a lot of counsel and input from many others, including many people in this room. One of the decisions that I think will prove to be on the plus side of the ledger, and they won't all be on the plus side, but there are a few that will be on the plus side, was to say yes to Bill D'Antonio when he and Tony Pogarel approached us about contacting the members of Voice of the Faithful and undertaking a sociological study of who we were. I'm certainly not the smartest guy in the room, and I know that, but I had the sense that what we had been going through was very important to the life of the church, and we needed to invite scholars from different disciplines to take a look at us, to study us, to bring their lens and their understanding to bear on what it was we were living. Our job wasn't to step back and do all of those studies. Our job was to keep doing the work of Voice of the Faithful. And so inviting Bill and Tony to communicate with so many of you and to learn all that they could was, it seems to me in retrospect, one of the most important and wisest decisions that I think was made during that time. When we look at the book, and I hope every one of you will take a copy and read it and think about the themes that are spelled out there, it should fill you with a great deal of pride, because it's about us. And it says that the things that brought us together, the energy that we shared, it wasn't mistaken, it wasn't misplaced, it was wise, and it was important to do the work that we committed ourselves to do. So you'll feel pride, but you'll also learn something, I think, in this book, because you'll learn a lot more than you probably knew before about all of the other people that were drawn together. It's not an exaggeration to say that what Bill and Tony found was that the people who really came to be involved in Voice of the Faithful, not just those founders, but all of the people involved, really were people who were drawn from the heart of the American Catholic Church. People who contributed in so many other ways to their church, but when this crisis arose, found that they had to take another step, a step to speak out and so forth. And so that's the movement that Voice of the Faithful became. It became a movement that was born out of conscience and concern, and yes, it was born out of anger too. I mean, that there isn't a person in this room, I think, who wasn't angry at some point early on as they read the stories and learned what the truth was. I was asking Pat whether this meeting tonight was the program committee had looked at the calendar and decided that February 27th was the exact right date to hold this meeting, and she said no, she didn't think that was the case. But this is a milestone date, and I wonder if anyone would have I guess, could you say what has happened on February 27th? Let's say in 2006? How about 2004? 2004 is one of the most, February 27, 2004 is one of the most memorable dates for Voice of the Faithful, because it was on that day that the National Review Board issued the John Jay study. It was on that day that we had those 2 volumes, which I brought with me tonight, my little bit of light reading, but 2 volumes that laid out in extraordinary detail what we've now come to know are the dimensions of the abuse crisis. Though that was a date in which I think, was both one of the best days for the church and one of the worst days. Clearly, the news was terrible, but it was also one of the best days for, I think, in my judgment, because there was finally sunlight on this problem that had been festering for more than 2 years in the public consciousness. So it was an important date. Does anyone remember that it was also a date that on that morning of the 27th of February, the National Review Board made its announcement at 10 a.m. in Washington. The press conference was held at the National Press Club, and there was a lot of media attention and so forth. But those of us from Boston should not forget that on that very same day, at 9:30 that morning, something else was happening. And that was the funeral was held for Patrick McSorley. Patrick McSorley, who was one of the original survivors of John Gagin's abuse, came forward in 2002, spoke up, was such a troubled person in so many fighting so many kinds of demons, as it was reported by his friends. But Patrick died on the 24th of February, and then his funeral was held on the 27th. We have an obligation, I think, having lived this experience, to provide the memory, to be the ones who remember, and don't let our fellow Catholics, ourselves and our fellow Catholics, forget what it is that we've been through. I think to answer the question that was put to the panel about assessing the impact and the future of Voice of the Faithful, we have to separate, or I had to separate, the organization Voice of the Faithful from the movement. The movement, I think, to look at what was accomplished, it introduced into our church, in the way that Jim and Alan were suggesting, it introduced powerful themes, a new kind of language that was very important. And today we talk freely and easily about transparency in the church. We talk about freely and easily about accountability in the church. And yet those are words that were not used frequently in 2002. I would submit to you that at least one of the things that this movement, Voice of the Faithful, contributed to was a change in the language and a change in the mindset of what the church as an institution needs to do in the modern world. We don't have the same kind of blind loyalty in 2008 that we had in 1958 when we were children, and certainly not in the time of our parents' childhood. So it's a new kind of loyalty. It's more informed, and it demands more of us and of those who are leaders in the institution. If we look at Voice of the Faithful as an organization, I think the picture is certainly more mixed. As an organization, we've had a few problems along the way. But we never set out to be a successful entrepreneurial organization. That was never the purpose. The mission isn't written in those terms. The mission is in terms of the participation of the Catholic laity in the governance and guidance of the church. It's very much about the role of the laity in the life of the church that we're about. So our organizational problems, we've always been trying to catch up in an organizational sense with where the movement was going. And we could talk later, I'm sure we will, about some of the organizational issues that have arisen over these 6 years. which ones have been resolved and which ones have been unresolved. We've just gone through an election, as all of you know, and that election was sharply contested. And I think that in the course of that debate that went on over probably 2 months, it was clear that a lot of things were put into, people were forced to ask themselves what they really cared about and what they cared about most and where that weighed in their judgment. And I think that is something that we'll come back to in the course of our conversation later on. But let me close by saying that I think that Voice of the Faithful, its impact, its future, needs to be thought of as a movement, as an organization, but there's another level at which it touches us, and that is it's as a personal experience. There isn't a person in this room who wasn't personally deeply affected in some way by the sexual abuse crisis, by the things that we've learned about the church, but who hasn't also found some personal value in the work that they've been able to do as a part of Voice of the Faithful or as an observer of Voice of the Faithful. I think it has meant a great deal to many of you and to many people who are not here tonight to be involved in a struggle that had meaning. And I think that is where I come down in terms of the ultimate assessment that the historians like Jim and others, his successors, will make of this. In 2003, there was a meeting at Yale, and one of the first meetings, a conference, and there were many historians there present at the meeting. At refreshment time, I asked a small group of them who were gathered at the bar. Apparently, historians do favor the bar. But I asked them whether Voice of the Faithful, do you think we'll make a footnote in the history of the church in the future? And one who was in his 80s and well known to that community, much revered, said, maybe even a paragraph. And I don't know if we're more than a paragraph. I think we're something more than a footnote. Maybe not yet a whole page, and maybe not even, never maybe to be a whole chapter. But I think at the personal level, we know that the struggle that we've been involved in has had meaning. One of the sad realities about Voice of the Faithful is that many of the people who have stayed with this effort over the years are on the white-haired side of life. And that's a blessing in many respects. But it also has an inevitable consequence, and we've been to too many funerals of late. Many of you will know that Ruth Kiley was volunteered at Voice of the Faithful's office in Newton for a good amount of time in the last part of her life, the last years of her life. She passed away last year, and at her funeral, her son talked about how much Voice of the Faithful meant to Ruth in the last couple of years of her life. I think Voice of the Faithful has filled an important place for many of us in terms of our relationship to the church. Over the time I was president, I can't tell you how many times people would say to me that I don't think I could be in the church if it wasn't for Voice of the Faithful. And that, I thought to myself, that's a pretty heavy burden to bear. I'm not sure about that. But what those expressions meant was, I think they meant, was that the work that Voice of the Faithful was doing, the work that all of us were committed to, created an important meaning in the lives of these people, that they couldn't reconcile, just as we couldn't reconcile, the behavior that we learned about with the church that we love. And working in this kind of reform was the antidote to that. It was the opportunity to try to fix things that had gone wrong. And I think if that's the last word on what Voice of the Faithful contributed to the church, that we were a people who tried to fix what went wrong, that wouldn't be a bad epitaph. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Our last speaker, Dennis Sheehan, is currently parochial vicar at Our Lady Help of Christians in Newton. Father Sheehan's 44 years in ministry have included seminary teaching and administration here at Blessed John the 23rd National Seminary and at the North American College in Rome. Father Sheehan has worked in campus ministry at Harvard, continuing education for priests in Rome, and parish ministry and administration in Cambridge. His area of doctoral study was in the history of liturgy and sacramental theology. Father Sheehan is also moderator of the Boston Archdiocesan Presbyteral Council and a member of the Committee for the Catholic Common Ground Project. Dennis.
Thank you, Pat. I'm frankly astounded to find myself here tonight. If you think that priests have no hesitation to speak upon topics about which they know little or nothing, I shall not disabuse you. But let me talk about the voice of the faithful in my own perspective, then and now and for the future. Then will be based on history, personal and otherwise. Now is simply my impressions fortified by some conversations I've had with other priests. Future is just speculation. I'm speaking to you as a parish priest, as one who loves this local church of Boston and who has been intimately involved in its life both through the recent crisis, before that, and since. So to then. Now, I remember that my personal impressions of the voice of the faithful as beginning were all quite positive, but I also remember that that wasn't the universal posture of my brother priests. I was impressed, for one thing, by the caliber and the competence and the commitment that was obvious in the men and women I met from the voice of the faithful. It was surprising that such a large cross-section of older, educated, and let's face it, largely traditional Catholics could be summoned to such a militant stance. Obviously, something had poked a stick in the cage of the sleeping bear. It was understandable the Catholics were horrified by the extent and duration of unaddressed abuse of young children and teenagers. But the voice of the faithful went a step beyond. It held the hierarchy, long considered beyond anything but quiet criticism, accountable for negligence, for mismanagement, for cover-up, and for collusion. Voice of the Faithful, among other organizations, but really primary among them, stood up to break the wall of silence and clerical self-protection that it found at the root of the crisis. But we have to remember, and I remember very well, that we were dealing with emotional issues as well. After all, a sense of betrayal or deceit can't be met by calm, rational analysis. Voice of the Faithful members became not only the voice of change, but the voice of shock and outrage and anger. Angry calls for change had not been on the horizon historically of the American church. And so pastors, quite understandably, were often overwhelmed or unable to cope with the anger that they heard. Bishops, for their part, lashed out largely at Voice of the Faithful. At times, the Voice of the Faithful hierarchical church confrontation became frankly ugly, didn't it? Voice of the Faithful was born in what I might call a perfect storm of protest and insurgency. To be honest, I wondered from the beginning also, and I'm sure several of us have, what impact the circumstances surrounding Voice of the Faithful's beginnings would have on its long-term life. It had energized successfully a large group of hitherto rather domesticated lay people. It had a clearly stated mission. But could it be more than just another protest group? And how permanent would be its energizing effects? You see, the church desperately needs, the kind of evangelical commitment that Voice of the Faithful espoused and cultivated. But the church needs and desperately needs that energy in a long-term and sustained way. Nonetheless, the history of the Voice of the Faithful is a history of our best Catholics in a certain socioeconomic group, struggling to respond to a crisis and to reform a church they loved very much. The heat of emotion should not cloud or obscure that. We caught a glimpse of great possibility in the Voice of the Faithful. And the question now is, as the smoke from the sexual abuse crisis is clearing, how could that protest energy be sustained? That's them. Voice of the Faithful now. 6 years later, the American Catholic Church is still struggling with the aftermath of the clergy sexual abuse. Many of our Catholic faithful have walked away. The sense of trust that binds us together as a church, at the parish level, it seems to me, is beginning to recover, but at the level of diocese and country and Church Universal has a much longer road to go. The Boston Catholic Church, and I suspect the American Catholic Church, will never be the same. We're still struggling to cope with fewer and aging clergy, with changed demographics, with financial crisis, and with the retention of a younger generation. That's a full plate. As a parish priest, I hear less often from or about Voice of the Faithful. My impression is that, Jim made the good distinction, that its organizational numbers have dwindled. Its membership still includes some of our best educated, most loyal and committed Catholics. Voice of the Faithful made a contribution of inestimable value. It gave corporate voice and a forum to Catholics who sensed an urgent need for change. I, for one, regret that the early energy and broad participation could not be maintained and grow exponentially. The Church very much needs that energy and that voice. In some ways, I fear that the caged bear has gone to sleep again, or at least is dozing. And my sense, too, is that the Voice of the Faithful struggles to get beyond its original middle-class, well-educated matrix. You see, I come from campus ministry and from traveling around the country and so forth, and I wonder, how are we doing with baby boomers, with Generation Xers, with campus Catholics? Voice of the Faithful represented passionate, committed, informed, and resourceful Catholics. But I wonder, can that message move into other social and economic areas of the Church and energize them as well for the future? I'll be briefest here because I'm a pastor, not a prophet. As the bishop said to the young priest, no one with any brains would have any difficulty thinking you were a prophet. The issues facing the Church now are, among others, leadership and competence. Those are serious issues. Tomorrow's Church will be either the Church of a strong, involved laity, or else it'll be smaller, weaker, and far less effective. I just wonder, could the Voice of the Faithful become a school of leadership for laity, a kind of a boot camp, not keeping its alumni together as an organization, but sending them into the parishes and church organizations and institutions from which they came in the first place, only that time stronger, more determined, and more vocal to make a change? Could it focus its considerable talent in the direction of identifying and encouraging and educating men and women for lay leadership in tomorrow's church? After all, we will need much more in the future even than in the past, strong voices and clear heads and committed faith. Sure, as the Voice of the Faithful has insisted, to lay place at the table of governance is a burning issue. I agree with that. But where are we going to prepare people for that? How are we going to energize people for that? Where are we going to give people a kind of vision for that? With that suggestion for your future, I I thank you for listening and hope that I haven't entirely justified your impression that priests often speak eloquently on issues about which they know nothing.
I think, Father Sheehan, these are issues about which you know a great deal. I'd like to begin our discussion by posing a couple of questions on my own here to our panel, and then I'll invite you to join me. I was struck that both Jim and Dennis Sheehan spoke about VOTF using some past tense verbs. Could you say a little more about that, Jim, perhaps? Begin with you. I'm assuming now, given the demographics which we've pointed to in the room and in the organization, also given what I assume also is dwindling membership and probably dwindling contributions, is VOTF going to disappear as an organization?
That's the first question.
That's the first question. In our lifetime. Maybe I should make it a little more specific. In our lifetime.
Predictions about the future are very difficult.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Well, they're not difficult to make. It's just if you worry about your credibility, then there's a little problem. I think Dennis put his finger really on one of the central questions about the future, and that is, if there is a future for Voice of the Faithful, then it has to be articulated in a way that people can buy into and invest their energy and feel that they're making a contribution to something that is worthwhile. The problem with our mission statement, in one sense, is that governance doesn't really engender a lot of positive energy for an agenda of change, but a vision of the church that includes the things that we've worked for, transparency, accountability, and so forth, and translates that into action at the parish and local level. That, I think, that has the potential to make Voice of the Faithful a movement and an organization that can endure. I think one of the greatest challenges that we face as an organization and as a community of people who care about the church is to sort out the criteria that we will use for assessing that the institutional leadership of the church is moving in a direction that we find consistent with what we have fought to bring to the church. And that struggle is not being made any easier by the reaction that we're seeing from many of the bishops. It's just, and I think that it has continued to go back to my milestone dates for a moment. If you went back to February 27th, 2 years ago, we were smack in the middle of the controversy involving Cardinal George in Chicago and Father Dan McCormick, and where Cardinal George had knowledge of the allegations about Father McCormick, and he allowed him to continue in his ministry. That is exactly the kind of headlong clash that is going to happen until the bishops understand that the work that the Catholic laity has invested in it can legitimately be incorporated as a part of the way in which the church does its business. But we're a long way from that. So it's a roundabout way of coming to the question you asked. Obviously I wouldn't have gone that roundabout way if I thought there was a quick, short, easy answer to it. There isn't. There just isn't.
Dennis or Jim? Jim, you had your hand up. Please.
Well, historians are more comfortable in the past than in the future, of course. But it seems to me that one thing we have to keep in mind is the changing context of the institution of the church, which is already changing and is going to continue to change. Dennis alluded to some of this. The average age of a Catholic priest in the United States has just passed 60. The numbers of newly ordained priests is far below the replacement rate. I did some counting for the year 2002, the year the crisis broke, here in Boston. That year, 6 new priests were ordained to the priesthood, 38 retired or died. You don't have to project those numbers very far out into the future before you come to an institutional crisis point. And it seems to me that changing context is going to mean that the institutional presence is just going to be different from what it has been in the recent past. Seems to me we're actually kind of going back to a much earlier period in the colonial era and the early years of the church in the United States, when there were very few priests and lay people found ways to sustain their Catholic identity in the absence of those structures of the church. That world is coming, whether bishops or organizations or lay people or anyone want it to. It's simply that context is going to change.
Please, James.
Let me just take it in a little different direction. How many people in this room would agree that 70 is the new 50? Now, I came across a study recently. You see, we worry that people in their 70s are kind of beyond the pale. Now, I've come, as I'm nearing 70, I come to a new point of view, but not just personally, that if 70 is the new 50, then that age group is the age group we can turn to in the church and say to them, okay, give us the energy you have. You have more free time, more disposable resources, more experience, more intelligence. Why should it bother us that people in a senior age group are so committed to the church? One of the things that might bother us, of course, is whether those people are replacing themselves. Because, after all, as they say, shepherds don't make sheep, sheep make sheep. So, I'm just saying I'm not so worried that the average age of the voice of the faithful is high, because in America the senior citizenry has an enormous contribution to make, and they can make it in a way that a younger generation can't. What I might worry about is what the church is going to look like in 20 years, whether there will still be people of this caliber there at the forefront of the church. Your mothers and your fathers, just like my mothers and my fathers, when they got to your age, were retired from everything. You are anything but that. Some of you ski 3 times a week and play golf 5 times a week. My oldest brother is 83, and he just stopped skiing last week. So I say, let's not worry about the senior citizen aspect of Voice of the Faithful. Let's rejoice in it and capture the energy that's there. But let's worry about the future of the church, which is a concern to all of us.
Jim alluded to the John Jay study. I remember a panel discussion of the John Jay study in this room, and right after it was published, and I was a participant, so I slogged through the John Jay study. And I remember a line that I quoted at the time. See if I can recall it. Bishops need not fear the active participation of faithful lay people. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, what a way to say that there's room in the church for lay people, the church after all, to take an active role in our... So my question is there room in the Roman Catholic Church for a lay movement that not only is an organization of lay people that want to improve themselves, like the Altar and Rosary Society, but also want to improve the church? Is there room for a voice of the faithful in the Roman Catholic Church?
Yes. There has to be. There has to be. Let me tell you a Boston College story. Actually, I have two Boston College stories. Where's Steve Sheehan? Steve Sheehan told me that in this very room he took freshman theology a few years ago. A few years ago. That's one BC story. But think about what progress has been made by bringing the talents of the laity to the church in the past few years. On financial reporting, we have much better financial transparency today, and there are programs now here at Boston College, at Villanova, in other colleges to train a new generation of young people for church management, and these themes are integral to that. That wouldn't have happened, I think, if without the crisis. I think the crisis was the catalyst for that, but it certainly accelerated it in ways that that Boston College and other Catholic colleges and universities have played a very important role. So the role of the laity around things that we value and we think are important for a healthy institution, those things are going to continue to grow. I think there's no question about that.
Could I just tell a story about that from my own experience? This goes back 25 years ago. I was rector of Blessed John the 23rd Seminary in Weston. I inherited an institution, frankly, that was on the brink of extinction. The enrollment was dwindling. We had no money. We had faculty. We had a small group of excellent students, but that was about all. We had a board of clergy trustees, the average age of which was about 85. And they told me I couldn't raise the tuition of the seminary at my first meeting because everything else was going up. It wasn't the kind of wisdom I really needed. So I talked to the Archbishop and said, we need to just take this whole thing and turn it upside down. We need to get some smart lay people involved. These people are no help to me, and I have strong limitations around things like public relations, development, all that sort of thing. So I got about a half a dozen really smart people with the help of my friends, and we put a board together. The rest is history. I always say if you want to bring life to a church institution, let the laity ride with it. That institution today is almost at capacity enrollment, older vocations, is well known all around the country, has a national board made up of bishops, priests, laymen, and laywomen, has a small endowment, is financially pretty secure, and it's all up to the lay people on the board of trustees who took ownership and run the place. And that's the kind of energy that we need to take out of the education world and begin to put into parishes and other church institutions to have them flourish that way. Where pastors and bishops have trusted lay people with that do not fear business, then it not only works, it flourishes. It will have growing pains, but it works. And it will have growing pains. I mean, there's no doubt about it, because on the opposite end of this, I spoke a couple of weeks ago to a pastor who's fairly new at what he's doing, and he's a little nervous about his own authority and his own place in the parish, and we were at a meeting together, and I said to him, well, what are you doing? Well, he said, I had a talk with so-and-so about, I don't know, I guess it was something to do with liturgy or music or something. And I said, well, she, the music director in the parish, knows a great deal about it. I said, I knew her years ago, and she's a very competent person. Why don't you just let her run with it? Well, he said, no, I'm the pastor. I have to have something to say. I said, well, find something to say that you know something about, but let her run the music. He didn't understand it. It was the be afraid thing. And that's what we've got to go beyond. Don't be afraid. There are people in this room from my former parish who I suppose in another world I might have been afraid of, but I don't think I ever was. And they took the ball and ran with it and did a really good job. So,
one more from me. It's a question that has been in my mind about VOTF since the conference, and it comes from Mary Hines, who is a sociologist who's one of the contributors of an essay and a conference paper in this volume. Mary Hines, in her essay, suggests that VOTF's narrow focus, these are her words, narrow focus on structure. Remember the 3 goals of VOTF. I don't have to tell you, you can tell me. VOTF's narrow focus on structure will soon become problematic and limiting. Sooner or later, she says, VOTF will have to speak on the Church's mission and doctrine. I expect, this is me now, I expect that VOTF has chosen not to speak on doctrine. The ordination of women, clerical celibacy, the way we choose our bishops, all those issues that VOTF might have spoken about. I expect VOTF chose not to because it didn't want to marginalize itself. Mary Hines's point is that it is marginalized because it has not spoken on those issues. It's a catch-22, and I envy any of you who can kind of work our way out of this. Anybody want to address this issue?
I think we ought to hear from Alan.
Alan.
Well, I'm listening and trying to make sense of this from where I come from some of these issues. And what I hear is a discussion very much internal to the Church. And I guess this last question also calls into question things that are pretty specific to Catholicism, the celibate priesthood, the all-male priesthood, and so on. And it's, of course, only within a church that you can talk about a church. But I think you run a risk of that and not appreciating the extent to which both the sexual abuse crisis and the larger forces at work are, to some degree or another, present in all American religions and in all American institutions. If I were to be at a meeting, for example, with Southern Baptists, we always hear that Southern Baptists are this rapidly growing. In fact, all those people that are leading the Catholic Church are becoming evangelicals or something like that. The Pew study shows actually that Southern Baptists are losing more people than they're gaining. And there's a rapid turnover in the church, but church is actually declining. Go to an organization that's concerned with the future of Judaism in America, and it's the Wailing Wall. It's just intermarriage, intermarriage, intermarriage. We're losing the kids, we're losing the kids. The Pew study shows that 4 out of 10 Americans are married to someone of a different faith tradition than they are. I mean, these are the sociological realities that sort of face every church. And so while there are these, I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly how to relate that to the larger question, but what strikes me as the particular Catholic response that's different from some of the responses of others is the way in which caring for the church takes on a different kind of form, it seems to me, in the Catholic Church, because it has a different kind of doctrine or a different kind of structure than other churches. So there's a general problem, but then there's a specific problem, and maybe the future of organizations like Voice of the Faithful will involve responding, being able to sort out what's a general problem facing all American institutions, especially religious ones, and then what's specific to Catholicism.
I think one of the realities that we have dealt with and in Voice of the Faithful around the point that Mary makes is that what brought us together was this extraordinarily awful set of circumstances, and people on the left, people on the right, people sort of across the political spectrum could all be outraged and could all be committed to redressing that wrong, to standing in support of survivors, to create the mechanisms and the remedies that internally that needed to be done. As soon as the focus shifted away from that and became broader on other issues, you have a lot of the very divisions that afflict the church, and there are people who feel that they don't have a home in Voice of the Faithful because it's too much this or that, and you can put the different labels on. So while I've talked with Mary about her suggestion, as a political reality inside Voice of the Faithful, it's very difficult to bridge that. And I think clearly, at least, I would argue till my last breath that the organization should not attempt to tackle the most volatile of the doctrinal issues. It just seems to me that there are organizations that do that. I think if individuals are committed to that, they can affiliate with those organizations. That's not what Voice of the Faithful really was created to do. And I teach a course on strategy for nonprofits, and over again, when we look at nonprofit organizations, one of the principal causes of failure is loss of focus on the mission. It's called, in the jargon of the field, it's called mission creep. The mission keeps getting bigger, wider, and you keep diluting what you came together to do the first time. Mission creep is deadly, and I guess that, to me, that it seems there may be wise people who will come along one day and figure out how to do that with Voice of the Faithful, but I'm not one of them.
The other thing that will affect this over time, and this is something that the Church in the 21st Century effort here at Boston College has talked a lot about, and that is the next generations of Catholics and handing on the faith and the traditions of faith, and also handing on kind of the commitment to the faith. Alan's right in saying that students here are very much attached to their faith. They think about it, they act on it. We have spring break next week. We're sending 800 kids to Appalachia to work with Habitat for Humanity rather than going to Acapulco and so on. But it is the case that among students, identification with the institution of the Church is just not what it is in the generations that we represent, and so that dilemma, I think, will affect this as well. I've never done any kind of scientific polling of my own students, but if I asked them, I'm sure that the majority of them would favor the ordination of women, would favor married clergy, would favor all kinds of other changes.
Could they name the sacraments?
They probably can't.
No, they can't. I've tried.
Yeah. And so
kind of get one.
Yeah, right. It's in their notes somewhere. They'll know it for the exam. But I think that dilemma of how the next generations will interact with and consider themselves a part of or not the institutional church will affect how lay people come down on that range of issues.
Yeah, I think that I spent some wonderful years at Harvard as a campus chaplain there. One of the chaplains, who was a very wise man, looked at me once and he said, "These are wonderful young people. We would have 650 people at an evening mass on Sunday. 25% of the Harvard population today is probably Catholic historically, okay? But the participation in the sacramental life of the church at Harvard is far higher on their part than it is in the national Catholic population," which is surprising. And certainly we don't have any silver bullet, otherwise we would have sold books and made lots of money. But it's just something that's there. But there's a shortcoming to it. As one of the chaplains said, who has served very, very well there, these young people would vote for Jesus, but they wouldn't know how to campaign for him. Now, that's a serious lack. They come from a weaker religious formation, and they come, quite honestly, because there was a monumental study of churches passing on their faith published about 2 years ago. They come also from weaker family backgrounds than a previous generation. And as one of the authors of the study said, it isn't that the parents are there pushing the kids in the front door of the church. We are already 2 generations away from that kind of committed every Sunday Catholicism. It's not something peculiar to this college or graduate level generation. It is also very much a part of their parents' generation. So we have a problem there. It's a problem which at Harvard we began to address it a couple of years ago using techniques from the evangelical churches for faith formation. I won't go into it very deeply, but it's been very successful. It's a combination of in-depth, intense, small group faith formation and community organization, learning to express your faith and invite other people into it. But the faith of the upcoming generation is something that's very enthusiastic. They're very good for the sacramental life of the church, but when it gets down to issues of doctrine or participation in governance or whatever, I'm not sure where some of these young people are going to be 10 or 20 years from now.
Well, maybe with the faith and vitality of the younger generation, it's a good point to leave this part of our program.